Good evening. It is a rainy afternoon in the year 1899. You walk into your local corner pharmacy. The shelves are lined with polished glass bottles. Behind the counter stands a man in a pressed waistcoat, his hands clean, his manner calm, his reputation unimpeachable. He has been here every morning for 20 years. He knows your name. He knows your family. When your child is ill, you come to him. Today your child has a cough. He does not ask for a prescription. He does not check a registry. He does not lower his voice or issue any warning at all. He simply turns to the shelf, reaches for a small amber bottle with a clean printed label, and places it on the counter in front of you. You hand him a few coins. He nods. The label reads, Heroin, manufactured by Bayer, one of the most respected pharmaceutical corporations on the surface of the earth, endorsed by the medical establishment, sold freely and legally across thousands of pharmacy counters in dozens of countries, recommended for children with persistent coughs, for adults with chest complaints, for anyone who needed, as the advertisements put it, something heroic. You take it home. You give it to your child. The coughing stops. A heavy, extraordinary calm settles over the room. You do not yet know what you have purchased. Tonight, we are going to open the dark cabinets of the past. We are going to walk slowly through the history of every deadly drug that was once perfectly legal, ranked one shelf at a time, from the most forgotten to the most devastating. Some of the medicines in this cabinet changed medicine forever. Others quietly destroyed millions of lives. And one of them would become the greatest pharmaceutical catastrophe in modern history. Not because it was the most addictive, not because it was sold by criminals, but because of who it was given to, and who had no say in the matter at all. If these quiet journeys into the darker corners of history help you rest, a like and a subscription means a great deal. And do leave a comment telling me where in the world you are tonight and what time it is where you are. It always moves me, the thought of so many people in so many different places settling in together with the same story. Now then, dim the lights a little more, set your phone beside you, and let us step inside the pharmacy. But if we begin with heroin, we begin at the end of the story. Every famous drug in this cabinet, every name that would eventually appear in legislation, in courtrooms, in headlines, was once an unknown bottle sitting quietly on a pharmacist's shelf. Unremarkable, trusted, ordinary. Each one had a beginning long before its consequences arrived. And to understand why these substances were welcomed so completely, trusted so thoroughly, and defended for so long by the people who should have known better, we have to start not with the famous names, but with the forgotten ones. So our cabinet opens not with the drugs whose stories you already know. It opens with one that almost nobody remembers today. The first drawer belongs to a substance called Chloral Hydrate. You may not recognize the name. You may, however, recognize its more informal title. Knockout Drops, a Mickey Finn, the substance that appears in old films when a character slips something into another character's drink and the lights go out. That reputation did not emerge from fiction. It emerged from history. Chloral hydrate was first synthesized in 1832 by a German chemist named Justus von Liebig, working in the university city of Gießen. He was not looking for a sedative. He was performing a chlorination reaction on ethanol, a routine experiment. And the result was an oily, somewhat pungent liquid, whose properties he noted but did not immediately understand. It would take nearly 4 more decades for anyone to understand those properties fully. In 1869, a physician named Matthias Liebreich introduced chloral hydrate into clinical practice after observing that the compound produced deep, reliable sleep in patients, not the fitful, partial sleep of exhaustion, a genuine, thorough unconsciousness, lasting, depending on the dose, between 4 and 8 hours. He published his findings. The medical community received them with considerable enthusiasm. Consider the world they were living in. This was 1869. Germ theory was only just beginning to gain acceptance among physicians. Pasteur's foundational work was little more than a decade old, and Lister's antiseptic techniques were brand new and still contested. There were no antibiotics. Anesthesia itself was barely 20 years old. The pharmacological tools available to physicians were, by any modern standard, extraordinarily crude. And here was something, a white crystalline powder, easily dissolved in water or alcohol, that could put a person to sleep within an hour, with a reliability that nothing else at the time could match. It entered widespread use almost immediately. Hospitals prescribed it. Asylums used it. With particular frequency, and it must be said, with particular disregard for the patients receiving it. Chloral hydrate became a standard mechanism of control in institutions housing those deemed mentally unwell, simply because it was the most effective tool available for making a distressed person stop moving. Doctors prescribed it for insomnia across every class of society. Mothers gave it to restless children. Pharmacists dispensed it without restriction. What the medical establishment took longer to notice was what the criminal world understood almost immediately. Chloral hydrate dissolved perfectly in alcohol, and the combination of a powerful sedative with ethanol, itself a central nervous system depressant, produced an effect far beyond either substance alone. A person given this mixture in a drink would lose consciousness rapidly, completely, and with very little warning. They would remember nothing of what followed. This was not a theoretical danger. In the saloons and boarding houses of Chicago, New York, and London in the 1870s and 1880s, there are documented cases of bartenders and proprietors administering chloral hydrate to customers for the purpose of robbing them while insensate. The most famous of these, a Chicago saloon keeper named Mickey Finn, lent his name to the practice so thoroughly that it persists in the language to this day. A Mickey Finn, a practice that originated with the world's first synthetic sedative, dispensed legally across the counter. Dependency crept in quietly, as it always does with sedatives. Patients who took chloral hydrate nightly for insomnia found, weeks or months later, that they couldn't sleep at all without it. They needed larger doses to achieve the same effect. Withdrawal, in those who had been taking it long enough, produced seizures and disorientation. The medical literature of the late 19th century noted these complications with the slightly detached tone of observers who had no real solution to offer. The drug remained in common use. The alternative was no sleep at all, and that was considered worse. Literary figures became dependent. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the pre-Raphaelite poet and painter, used chloral hydrate extensively in the later years of his life. It was available to him from any pharmacy, at any time, in any quantity he chose to purchase. Chloral hydrate remained a routinely prescribed sleep aid well into the 20th century. Its clinical use only truly declined in the 1950s with the arrival of barbiturates and later benzodiazepines, which appeared to offer similar sedation with fewer risks. The FDA never formally approved it. It persists today in a small number of niche applications: veterinary sedation, pre-procedure sedation in pediatrics under specialist supervision. It is one of the oldest synthetic drugs in existence, and it was number 10 in this cabinet for a reason. It was not the most dangerous thing on these shelves. It was the key that opened the lock on what would come after. Chloral hydrate proved something the 19th century was beginning to suspect, but had not yet fully confronted: that chemistry could produce sedation, unconsciousness, and dependency with extraordinary efficiency. That the same compound that helped a suffering patient sleep could be used against a person who had never consented to take it. That the distance between medicine and poison was frequently a matter of dose and intent rather than a matter of category. But laudanum was only the beginning of what this cabinet contained. The next drawer sits just above it, and it holds something that would become, for a time, the defining pharmaceutical of the Victorian world. First, however, we pass through something that is perhaps even more forgotten. There is a word in the English language that means a statement so commonplace, so dull, so thoroughly unremarkable, that it deserves no further consideration. A tedious platitude, a thing said so often and so emptily that it passes through the mind without leaving a trace. The word is bromide. It came from a drug, potassium bromide, and its chemical relatives, sodium bromide and ammonium bromide, entered medical practice in the 1850s and 1860s as treatments for epilepsy. They were among the first compounds ever shown to reduce seizure activity in humans, and for a period of several decades, they represented one of the most significant advances in neurology that the medical profession possessed. For epileptic patients for whom the alternative had been various combinations of bleeding, cold water immersion, dietary restriction, and the honest acknowledgement that nothing worked very well at all, bromide salts offered something genuinely meaningful. Seizure frequency fell. Some patients experienced long remissions. Physicians were, not unreasonably, impressed. And then, as tends to happen with any substance that demonstrably does something to the human brain, the applications began to expand. Bromides were prescribed for anxiety, for the condition then known as neurasthenia, a vague, capacious diagnosis that encompassed fatigue, irritability, nervous exhaustion, and what we might now recognize as depression. They were prescribed for what Victorian medicine called hysteria, a diagnosis applied almost exclusively to women and characterizing a broad range of emotional states: grief, distress, sexual frustration, or simply having opinions at an inconvenient moment, as pathological conditions in need of pharmacological correction. Bromide salts were prescribed for sleeplessness, for headaches, for general agitation, for children who cried too much, and for adults who thought too much. They were sold in patent medicines across Britain and America without restriction, under brand names that communicated calm and safety and restoration. What was not widely understood at the time was the nature of bromide toxicity. Unlike many substances that act acutely, whose dangers arrive quickly, obviously, urgently, bromide salts accumulate in the body slowly. The bromide ion displaces chloride in the nervous system and elsewhere, and it does so incrementally over weeks and months of regular use. The patient does not feel acutely worse. They feel at first somewhat sedated, which was, after all, the intention. The physician nods approvingly. The prescription continues, but with sustained use, something else begins to happen. A cluster of symptoms that physicians of the era called bromism, persistent mental sluggishness, a kind of deepening blankness, skin eruptions, acne-like lesions called bromodema, sometimes severe and disfiguring, tremor, loss of coordination, psychotic symptoms in extreme cases, and a pervasive characteristic quality that observers struggled to describe precisely but recognized immediately: a flattening, a heaviness of thought and expression so thorough that the person in front of you seemed to have been replaced by a slower, quieter, emptier version of themselves. In the asylums, where bromides were administered to dozens of patients simultaneously and with limited monitoring, this effect was widespread. Entire wards of people walking slowly, speaking rarely, sitting for hours without apparent thought or response. This was understood at the time, not as a side effect of the medication, but as evidence of the underlying condition. The patients seemed calmer. The reports described improvement. The connection between the drug and the dulling it produced was made in the medical literature. But it traveled slowly, and it competed with the genuine benefits the drug provided for epilepsy. Benefits that were real and clinically significant. And that meant physicians were reluctant to abandon the compound entirely. Bromides remained in common use into the early 20th century. They lingered in patent medicines well past the point at which the dangers of chronic use were clearly established. In the United States, bromide-containing patent preparations were still available over the counter into the 1970s. And the word they left behind, bromide, meaning a dull and empty platitude, survived long after most people forgot where it came from. It came from the patients, from the people who had been given these salts in good faith, or sometimes in the interest of institutional convenience, and who had emerged from the treatment speaking slowly and saying very little. The word drifted from the ward into the drawing room, into the newspaper column, into the everyday language of the culture, stripped of its origin, stripped of the faces behind it. It is a peculiar kind of memorial. Chloral hydrate and the bromides were not, by the standards of what this cabinet still holds, particularly dramatic. They were not corporate deceptions on an industrial scale. They were not state-sponsored pharmaceutical programs. They were not branded with famous names and sold in every country on earth. They were simply the earliest lesson, the first demonstration that a drug could do something useful and something terrible at the same time, and that without the tools to distinguish between those two things, without the regulatory frameworks, the long-term trials, the systematic monitoring, the medical profession would default to optimism, would see the good and trust that the bad was manageable. That lesson would need to be learned again, and again, and again. The next shelf up in this cabinet holds something older than chloral hydrate, something that was not synthesized in a laboratory, something that grew from the earth, that had been used by human beings for thousands of years before anyone understood what it was. Something that the 19th century took from its ancient context, purified, concentrated, and distributed to millions of people who had no idea what they were welcoming into their homes. The drawer is heavier than the ones below it. The cabinet opens a little wider here. The bottles on this shelf are not small. They are generous, amber-colored domestic things. The kind of bottle that sits on a kitchen shelf beside the vinegar and the cooking salt, close enough to reach without thought, available enough to require no particular occasion. In the mid-19th century, this bottle was in a very large number of British and American homes. It was considered approximately as ordinary as aspirin is today, if aspirin also happened to contain one of the most powerfully addictive substances ever extracted from a living plant. The bottle contained laudanum. Laudanum was a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, roughly 10 parts alcohol to 1 part opium, usually flavored with cinnamon, sometimes with saffron, always with whatever the manufacturer felt would make the bitterness more palatable. It had existed in various forms since the 16th century, when the Swiss alchemist Paracelsus first described a preparation of this kind. But it was the 19th century that turned laudanum from a curiosity of the wealthy into a product of mass consumption. A quarter ounce of laudanum in Victorian Britain cost approximately 1 penny, the same price as a pint of beer. It required no prescription. It carried no age restriction. It was sold from pharmacies, yes, but also from grocers, from bakers, from market stalls, from door-to-door salesmen who moved through working-class neighborhoods with their cases of patent remedies, from country peddlers who served rural communities that had no pharmacy at all. If you wanted laudanum in mid-19th century Britain or America, you wanted it for approximately the same amount of effort and social complexity as wanting a loaf of bread. Doctors recommended it for almost everything, pain obviously, of almost any origin, in almost any location, in almost any severity, but also for coughs, for diarrhea, for cholera, for menstrual cramps, for tuberculosis, for depression, for traveling sickness, for hay fever, for insomnia, for the grief of bereavement, for the anxiety of poverty, for the loneliness of industrial city life in an era when millions of people had recently been displaced from the agricultural communities where their families had lived for generations and deposited into vast, grey, overcrowded urban centers with no social infrastructure to receive them. It worked in the way that complete chemical sedation always works, at least initially. The pain receded, the anxiety receded, the cough quieted, the grief became, for a few hours, something that could be looked at from a manageable distance. Women used it in particular quantities. This is not incidental. In Victorian society, women were largely excluded from pub culture, the primary social lubricant available to working-class men. They could not walk into a tavern unaccompanied without serious social consequences, but they could walk into a pharmacy or a grocery, and they could purchase laudanum without anyone finding it remarkable. Many women who developed profound dependencies did so entirely within the norms of respectable behavior because their consumption occurred in domestic spaces, from legitimate commercial sources, without any of the social markers that would have identified a man's equivalent use as problematic. A woman who took laudanum nightly was, in many households, simply a woman managing her nerves. The bottle on the shelf was medicine. It had always been medicine. Her mother had used it. Her grandmother had used it. The darkest chapter in laudanum's history, however, does not belong to adults. For thousands of years, long before laudanum was the specific preparation available, opium had been given to infants. The reasoning was simple, if brutal. Babies cry. Crying disturbs sleep. Disturbing the sleep of adults who need to work is economically disruptive, and opium stops crying with extraordinary efficiency. In the 19th century, this ancient practice had been repackaged and commercialized. Products with names like Godfrey's Cordial, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, and Mother Bailey's Quieting Syrup were sold specifically for use on infants and young children. Their active ingredients were opium, laudanum, or morphine in solution. Their marketing was warm and domestic and reassuring. Their packaging featured mothers and babies. Their labels promised soothing and quieting and rest. They delivered on those promises. A child given Godfrey's Cordial would stop crying, would sleep long and deeply, would, for a few hours, be entirely still. Some of them did not wake up. The cases appear in court records of the era. The Old Bailey's archive contains documented instances of infant deaths attributed to laudanum dosing by parents and caregivers who genuinely did not understand that what they were administering was a potentially fatal depressant. In at least one case, a surgeon's assistant testified that a single drop of laudanum had been known to poison a child, that a teaspoon could kill. The parents who had given it had followed the instructions on the label. They had done what the product told them to do. The regulatory response was extraordinarily slow. The UK Pharmacy Act of 1868 placed some restrictions on the sale of raw opium, but crucially, it exempted patent medicines that happened to contain opium as an ingredient. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup continued to be sold legally in Britain until the end of the 19th century. Over-the-counter opium sales in general persisted until the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920. Laudanum was a standard component of the home medical kit well into the early 20th century. By the time the legislation arrived, several generations of ordinary families had been quietly building dependencies they did not recognize, treating conditions that did not require opiates with opiates, and dosing their infants with compounds that would today constitute criminal child endangerment. And laudanum was not even the concentrated form. The same shelves, the same polish glass, a different bottle, because just above laudanum in this cabinet sits something that the 19th century believed was an improvement, a purification, a refinement, a more precise and therefore more trustworthy version of what opium already offered. It was not an improvement. In the early years of the 19th century, a 20-year-old pharmacy apprentice in the small German city of Paderborn began working on a problem that had occupied physicians for centuries without resolution. Opium was the most powerful painkiller available to medicine. Everyone knew this. Everyone used it. But opium was a raw plant product, and raw plant products are, by their nature, inconsistent. A batch of opium from one harvest might contain a certain concentration of its active compounds. The next batch might contain half as much, or twice as much. A physician who prescribed a standard dose of opium for one patient and then gave the same dose to the next had no reliable way of knowing whether he was providing relief or administering an overdose. The potency was, to a significant degree, guesswork. Friedrich Wilhelm Serturner wanted to isolate the active ingredient, to extract the specific compound within opium that produced its effects, weigh it precisely, and administer it in controlled quantities. He worked on this problem between roughly 1803 and 1806, testing his extractions first on animals, dogs, mice, and eventually, with the quiet recklessness that characterized experimental science in that era, on himself and on several of his friends. The substance he isolated was a white crystalline alkaloid. He named it, in his published papers, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, Morphine. It was the first time in human history that a chemist had isolated the pure active ingredient from a medicinal plant, a genuine foundational breakthrough, not merely in the treatment of pain, but in the entire methodology of pharmacology. Serturner did not just discover morphine. He established for the first time the principle that plants contain specific chemical compounds responsible for their effects, and that those compounds can be extracted, purified, and used independently. Every pharmaceutical derived from a natural source in the 2 centuries since rests, conceptually, on what he did in Paderborn. In its pure form, morphine is approximately 10 times stronger than raw opium. This was the refinement the medical establishment had been seeking. A predictable dose, a reliable effect, something a physician could prescribe with confidence. The confidence, as it turned out, was somewhat misplaced. Morphine entered commercial production in the 1820s and became widely available in the following decades. By mid-century, it was a standard medical tool, not exotic, not specialist, but routine. And then, in 1853, something arrived that changed the pharmacology of addiction in ways that the medical establishment did not immediately grasp. The hypodermic needle. Before the hypodermic needle, morphine was swallowed. It had to pass through the digestive system, be absorbed through the gut wall, and travel through the bloodstream to the brain. This process took time. It also lost potency along the way. The effects arrived slowly and built gradually and faded over a period of hours. Injected morphine does not work this way. Injected morphine reaches the brain within seconds, the full dose, all at once. The effect is not a gradual rise, but a sudden and total arrival, an experience that, by every account, those who encountered it for the first time found unlike anything they had previously experienced. Physicians who observed their patients receiving injected morphine for the first time noted the rapidity of pain relief with admiration. They noted, somewhat less promptly, that the patients wanted the relief again, and soon, and in larger quantities. The Civil War accelerated everything. Between 1861 and 1865, the Union Army alone issued approximately 10 million opium pills and 2.8 million ounces of opium powders and tinctures to its soldiers. Morphine was injected in the field, on the battlefield, in the surgical tents where surgeons worked through the night amputating limbs that could not be saved, trying to manage pain with the only reliable tool they had. The scale of the suffering was enormous. The scale of the morphine distribution to address that suffering was enormous in equal measure. When the war ended, an estimated 400,000 soldiers returned home addicted. Some accounts describe this as a figure specific to the Union side alone. The Confederate Army had its own supply lines, its own field surgeons, its own morphine, its own resulting dependencies. The phrase that appeared in American medical literature of the 1870s was not delicate about what had happened. The army disease, morphine addiction, acquired in service, brought home from the battlefield like a wound that didn't bleed visibly, and therefore went unaddressed by anyone who had the authority to address it. These men had fought a war. They had earned their morphine. The country was not, in the immediate aftermath of the deadliest conflict in its history, in a mood to tell them they could not have it. And there was no treatment for withdrawal. There was no clinical infrastructure for managing dependency. There was, in 1865, not even a widely shared medical consensus that morphine dependency was a disease rather than a moral failure. So the soldiers managed it themselves. They bought their morphine from pharmacies, from patent medicine suppliers, from the mail-order catalogs that would arrive at their farmhouses with pages of remedies for every conceivable ailment. The dependency became domestic. It became ordinary. It settled into the fabric of post-war American life with very little fanfare and very little comprehension. Meanwhile, morphine continued to be prescribed freely for all the same conditions as laudanum, and then some, for post-operative pain, for the pain of cancer, of tuberculosis, of childbirth, of neuralgia, for depression, for anxiety, for the general difficulty of existence in a world that had not yet developed any other reliable analgesic. The medical profession was aware by the 1870s and 1880s that morphine produced dependency. The awareness appears in the journals of the period with something between discomfort and resignation, a recognition that the problem existed, combined with a limited set of alternatives for managing it. Dependency was documented, named, discussed, and then the prescriptions continued, because the patients were in pain, and pain without morphine was worse than pain with morphine, plus the inconvenience of needing morphine again tomorrow. By the 1890s, the question that occupied the more forward-thinking minds in pharmacology was not whether morphine was addictive. That much was established. But whether something could be found that provided the same pain relief without the dependency. A better morphine, a cleaner version, something that offered the good without the consequences. A German chemist at a company called Bayer was working on exactly this problem. He believed he had found the answer. He synthesized his solution on the 21st of August, 1897. He had 11 days earlier synthesized something else that would change medicine forever: aspirin. Two world-altering compounds from the same bench within 2 weeks. One of them would save countless millions of lives. The other would destroy countless millions of others. And it was the one meant to fix morphine. His name was Felix Hoffmann, and in the late summer of 1897, he was a chemist at the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in Elberfeld, Germany, working on two separate problems at the same time. The first problem was aspirin. His supervisor had tasked him with finding a version of salicylic acid, a compound already known to reduce fever and pain, that would be gentler on the stomach. The existing form caused significant gastric distress and was difficult for patients to tolerate. Hoffmann worked on this problem, adjusted the molecular structure, and on the 10th of August, 1897, he produced what would eventually be called acetyl salicylic acid. Aspirin, one of the most widely used drugs in human history, still prescribed daily in the 21st century for everything from headaches to heart attacks. 11 days later, on the 21st of August, he turned to the second problem. The second problem was morphine. His supervisor, a man named Heinrich Dreser, who led Bayer's pharmacological research department, had asked him to work on the question that occupied the whole of the medical establishment at that moment: how to produce a compound with morphine's analgesic properties, but without morphine's inconvenient tendency to produce dependency. The hypothesis was that acetylation, the same chemical process Hoffmann had used on salicylic acid, might modify morphine in useful ways, might soften its grip, might produce a version of the relief without the trap. Hoffmann acetylated morphine. The result was diacetylmorphine, a white, crystalline powder with a slightly bitter taste, soluble in water, producing rapid and powerful sedation and pain relief when administered to test subjects. It was, as the subsequent century would demonstrate with terrible thoroughness, approximately 1.5 to 2 times more potent than morphine by weight. It crossed the blood-brain barrier significantly faster than morphine, which was the feature that made it feel, to everyone who took it, remarkably clean, remarkably swift, remarkably complete. The relief arrived before the patient had fully registered that anything had changed, and the relief when it came was total. Dreser received Hoffmann's results and understood that he had something commercially significant. He named it. The name came from the German word heroisch, meaning strong, heroic, admirable, something that performed beyond ordinary expectations, something that exceeded the measure of common things. Heroin. Bayer began commercial production in 1898. The packaging was straightforward and clean. Amber glass bottles, colored labels, precise dosage information, the reassuring Bayer name stamped across everything in the confident typography of a company that believed in its own product. The pitch to physicians was equally direct. Heroin offered the cough-suppressing and pain-relieving properties of morphine without morphine's known risks. It was, Bayer's marketing materials stated explicitly, a non-addictive morphine substitute. It was sold in the early years not directly to the public, but to physicians and pharmacists, who then dispensed it over the counter in a variety of forms: tablets, elixirs mixed in glycerin solution, water-soluble heroin salts for injection, and the detail that has most thoroughly lodged itself in the historical memory: cough syrup for children. The logic at the time was not as grotesque as it sounds to modern ears, though it was grotesque nonetheless. Cough was the primary symptom of tuberculosis, which was the leading infectious killer of the 19th century. Millions of people, adults and children, had chronic, debilitating, exhausting coughs from tuberculosis, bronchitis, pneumonia, and dozens of other respiratory conditions that medicine had very limited tools to address. Morphine suppressed coughing effectively, but physicians were now alert to morphine's risks and increasingly reluctant to prescribe it for children. Heroin appeared to offer the same suppressive effect without, so the advertising claimed, the danger. Bayer's medical literature published clinical accounts, some of them genuine, describing heroin's effectiveness in children and adults as a respiratory sedative. Physicians who tried it reported that patients were satisfied. The coughing stopped, breathing eased, the patients rested. The patients also, in a pattern that became apparent within a remarkably short time, wanted more, found themselves needing more to achieve the same effect, found the interval between doses contracting, found that when the dose was delayed, something arrived in the body that was worse than the original cough, a restlessness, an ache, a climbing anxiety that only the next dose resolved. The medical profession began noting these observations in print by approximately 1902. By 1905 and 1906, the dependency cases were documented with sufficient frequency that the pattern was undeniable. Physicians wrote to journals describing patients who had begun taking heroin for a legitimate respiratory complaint and had arrived months later at a place where they could not function without it. Bayer, by this point, was aware of the data. They had the reports. They had the journal correspondence. They had the accounts from their own consulting physicians and from the broader medical network through which their product moved. They understood, with whatever degree of corporate clarity existed in the pharmaceutical industry of 1905, what they had made and what it was doing. They continued to sell it. This is the detail that the history tends to pass over too quickly. So let us stay with it for a moment, because it matters. There was a period, beginning approximately 1902, and extending for at least several years afterward, during which Bayer possessed accumulating evidence that heroin produced dependency at rates that exceeded anything their marketing had claimed, that patients were arriving at severe addiction through legitimate prescribed use, that the non-addictive characterization that had been central to their entire commercial pitch was not merely optimistic, but demonstrably false. They knew. They had the data. They sold it anyway. The discontinuation came quietly and gradually. Bayer stopped active promotion of heroin without ever making a public announcement about the reasons. The company did not recall its product. It did not issue corrections to the physicians who had been told it was safe. It did not contact the patients, the adults and the children and the soldiers and the mothers and the grandmothers who had begun taking it in good faith and found themselves unable to stop. It simply moved on. By 1910, the medical consensus had shifted sufficiently that heroin was no longer being enthusiastically recommended. By 1914, the United States Harrison Narcotics Tax Act placed significant restrictions on heroin distribution. By the 1920s, its non-medical use was proliferating in exactly the form that would characterize it for the rest of the century, purchased from illicit sources at escalating cost by people who had lost the capacity to choose otherwise. Bayer, in the meantime, had suffered a separate indignity. Under the terms of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, Germany was required to surrender certain industrial assets and intellectual properties as part of the war reparations process. Among these were Bayer's trademark rights in multiple countries to two of its most commercially significant products. One was aspirin, the other was heroin. Both names, trademarked by the same company, synthesized by the same chemist within 11 days of each other, went into the public domain. Aspirin because the world wanted to manufacture it freely and save lives. Heroin because the world wanted to pursue those who sold it criminally and end its manufacture entirely. It is one of the more compressed and specific ironies in pharmaceutical history that a man who created two compounds in the same 2 weeks left behind a name that would become synonymous with healing and a name that would become synonymous with destruction, and that both left his workbench as solutions. Heroin sits at number 6 in this cabinet, not because its consequences were limited. They were not. The consequences of heroin, measured across the full arc of the 20th century and into the 21st, are almost impossible to quantify in human terms. The addiction, the crime, the overdose deaths, the communities hollowed out by dependency, the children born into families organized entirely around its acquisition. It sits at number 6 because the entries above it represent something additional to individual addiction. They represent systematic institutional deception on scales that heroin, for all its destruction, did not quite reach. They represent governments and corporations not merely selling a dangerous compound, but actively constructing false identities for it, embedding it in beloved products, distributing it to entire armies by official decree, administering it to pregnant women and watching what happened. The cabinet deepens, and somewhere in the United States, in the city of Atlanta, in the years immediately preceding Hoffman's work at Bayer, a pharmacist named John Pemberton was doing something that seems, at first glance, almost comical in comparison to what we have just reviewed. He was inventing a soft drink. He was inventing it from cocaine, and he was about to create the most recognized commercial brand in the history of human civilization. A note before the next entry, because it is worth pausing here. We are 5 entries into this cabinet, and a pattern has asserted itself clearly enough to name. Every substance we have reviewed so far was adopted by the medical establishment in good faith, or something close to it. Chloral Hydrate was a genuine solution to a genuine problem. Bromides offered real benefits for epilepsy. Laudanum managed real pain. Morphine was and remains one of the most effective analgesics ever produced. Heroin was designed as a safer alternative to something already known to be dangerous. The failures were not, in most cases, failures of malice at the point of origin. They were failures of knowledge, of the tools needed to detect dependency at the population level, to conduct long-term trials, to separate the experience of early users from the experience of long-term users, to distinguish between what a drug did in the first weeks and what it did in the years that followed. What arrived later, what Bayer's continued marketing of heroin after the dependency evidence accumulated represents, was something different. That was not ignorance, that was a choice. This distinction will become increasingly important as we move up the shelf, because the next entries did not begin in laboratories looking for medical solutions. Some of them began in drawing rooms and corporate offices and government ministries, pursuing something rather more straightforward: profit, performance, power. The story of what follows is not the story of medicine going wrong by accident. It is the story of something going wrong on purpose, at scale, with full institutional support. The next shelf is heavier than the ones before it. John Stith Pemberton was not, by the standards of his era, an unusual man. He was a pharmacist from Columbus, Georgia. He had served as a lieutenant colonel in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, where he had been wounded. A saber cut across the chest at the Battle of Columbus in April 1865, one of the final engagements of the war, fought just days before the formal surrender. The wound was serious. The treatment was morphine. And like so many soldiers who passed through the medical tents of that conflict with the same wound and the same remedy, he returned from the war carrying something inside him that had not been there when he left: a morphine dependency. He was not ashamed of it. There was, in the culture of the 1870s and 1880s, very little social vocabulary for what he had become. He was simply a man in pain who had found the thing that managed the pain and who needed it to function, and who was aware, at some level, that this was a problem he had not yet solved. He began looking for a solution, and the solution that the medical establishment of the 1880s was pointing toward, the compound that physicians and chemists and patent medicine manufacturers were all talking about, all experimenting with, all writing enthusiastic papers about, was cocaine. To understand why Pemberton arrived at cocaine as a response to his morphine dependency, we need to understand what cocaine represented to the medical world of 1884. Because in that year, a young Viennese physician published a paper that would set off a wave of professional enthusiasm, unlike almost anything the pharmaceutical world had seen in decades. His name was Sigmund Freud. The paper was called Ubercoca, and it described cocaine as a substance of almost miraculous potential, effective against depression, against morphine addiction, against fatigue, against a range of nervous complaints that the existing pharmacopoeia could barely touch. Freud was not alone, and he was not speaking from ignorance. Cocaine genuinely did what he described in the short term. It lifted mood. It eliminated fatigue. It produced a sensation of clarity and capability and confidence that nothing else available in 1884 could replicate. Surgeons discovered that it was a remarkable local anesthetic, the first effective one ever found. Dentists adopted it immediately. It was used in eye surgery, in nasal surgery, in procedures that had previously required the patient to simply endure significant pain or be rendered fully unconscious. The problem, as with every entry in this cabinet, was the distance between the short term and the long term. And in 1884, that distance had not yet been traveled. But before Freud, before the Viennese papers, before the surgical applications, there was something else, something that had been available and popular and socially respectable for over 20 years before cocaine was even a recognized name in Western medicine. There was Vin Mariani. Angelo Mariani was a French chemist born on the island of Corsica in 1838. He had read, with considerable interest, the accounts emerging from South America describing the effects of coca leaves on the indigenous peoples who chewed them, the endurance they provided, the fatigue they eliminated, the way they allowed people to work at altitude in conditions that would otherwise exhaust them within hours. He had also read the work of an Italian physician named Paolo Mantegazza, who had traveled in South America and had become the first person to extract cocaine from coca leaves using ethanol as a solvent. Mariani understood something about that extraction. When coca leaves were steeped in alcohol, specifically in wine, the ethanol acted as a solvent and drew the cocaine out of the leaves and into the liquid. A wine infused with coca leaves was not merely wine with a vegetable garnish. It was a cocaine delivery vehicle, and the combination of cocaine and alcohol produced, in the body, a third compound called cocaethylene, which intensified and extended the euphoric effects of both substances simultaneously. In 1863, Mariani created Vin Tonique Mariani, Mariani's tonic wine, from Bordeaux and coca leaves. He began marketing it as a health tonic. The advertising copy described it as restoring health, strength, energy, and vitality. It contained 6 milligrams of cocaine per fluid ounce. The version exported to the United States contained 7.2 milligrams per ounce because American competitors were already putting higher concentrations of cocaine into their own products, and Mariani needed to remain competitive. Consider that for a moment. There was a market for cocaine-infused wine that was competitive enough that manufacturers were adjusting their cocaine concentrations upward to maintain market share. This was not a fringe product. It was not sold in back alleys or to marginal populations. Vin Mariani was the celebrity product of the 19th century, the most publicly endorsed commercial preparation in the Western world. Pope Leo XIII carried a personal flask of it. He appeared on a promotional poster for the brand. He awarded Angelo Mariani a Vatican gold medal for the contribution Vin Mariani had made to human well-being. The Pope of Rome endorsing cocaine wine on a promotional poster. Thomas Edison drank it and said it helped him stay awake while working. Jules Verne praised it. Queen Victoria consumed it. President William McKinley of the United States was listed among its admirers. The Prince of Wales, members of the French Academy, generals, bishops, industrialists, poets, scientists, and surgeons. Mariani assembled testimonials from hundreds of famous and influential figures and published them in a series of promotional albums that circulated internationally. The endorsements were not, by the standards of the era, fraudulent. Vin Mariani worked. It did what it said it did. It provided energy, lifted mood, reduced fatigue, and left the consumer feeling capable and clear in ways that nothing non-alcoholic could match at the time. The famous people who endorsed it were not lying. They had taken it and they had felt its effects, and those effects were, at least initially, and in the short term, exactly as advertised. What the advertisements did not mention was the dependency. What the testimonials did not address was what happened when the wine was not available. What the Vatican gold medal did not acknowledge was that the beneficial feelings were produced by a highly addictive stimulant whose long-term effects were entirely unknown because nobody had conducted a long-term study, because there were no regulatory frameworks requiring one, because the entire concept of such a framework had not yet been invented. It was medicine. It was also cocaine. In the 1870s and 1880s, these categories did not feel contradictory. One of the people following Vin Mariani's commercial success with professional interest was John Pemberton, still managing his morphine dependency in Atlanta. In 1884, inspired partly by Mariani's model and partly by the new medical literature on cocaine as a potential treatment for morphine addiction, he developed his own product, Pemberton's French wine Coca, a locally produced version of the same idea. Wine combined with coca extract and, in Pemberton's formulation, cola nut for additional caffeine content. He marketed it as a remedy for a range of ailments, including explicitly as a treatment for morphine and opium dependency. He was, in a sense, attempting to cure himself, to replace one substance that had its hooks in him with another that had not yet shown its hooks. This was a pattern the 19th century repeated often and without apparent irony. Treating the consequences of one drug with another drug, each successive substitution presented as a breakthrough, each breakthrough eventually revealing its own consequences. And then, in 1885, the state of Georgia enacted local prohibition legislation. Alcohol was to be removed from sale in Atlanta and Fulton County. Pemberton could no longer sell wine, but he could still sell coca extract. He reformulated his product, removing the wine and replacing it with carbonated water and sugar syrup. The new preparation was non-alcoholic. It was fizzy. It was sweet. It was still laced with cocaine from the coca leaf extract he continued using as a primary ingredient. His business partner, Frank Robinson, named the reformulated beverage Coca-Cola for its two stimulant ingredients, coca and cola, and penned the elegant script logo that would, within a few decades, become one of the most recognized visual symbols on Earth. Coca-Cola, available at every soda fountain in Atlanta, marketed as a brain tonic and intellectual beverage containing cocaine. It was not unusual for the era. One drug manufacturer in 1885 was selling cocaine in 15 different commercially available forms. Cigarettes, inhalants, cordials, crystals, solutions, and half a dozen other preparations. Cocaine was available in drugstores, saloons, mail-order catalogs, and grocery stores across the United States. There were no restrictions on its sale. There were no age limits. There were no labeling requirements that would have told the purchaser what, precisely, they were purchasing. The medical literature eventually caught up. The dependency cases accumulated through the 1890s. The recreational use became visible and then alarming. By 1903, Coca-Cola had removed pharmacologically active cocaine from its formula, replacing the crude coca extract with a decoconized version that retained the flavor of the leaf without the drug. The company has used this decoconized extract ever since, which is why Coca-Cola still technically contains coca leaf. Simply not the part of the coca leaf that causes the effects that made it famous. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required that cocaine, along with heroin and several other substances, be accurately labeled on any product that contained it. This requirement alone caused sales of cocaine-containing products to fall by approximately one-third. People had been consuming cocaine in patent medicines, tonics, and soft drinks without knowing it. When they found out what was in the bottle, many of them stopped buying it. That single statistic is worth sitting with for a moment. One-third of the market for these products depended in some meaningful way on the consumer not knowing what they were buying. By 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act placed such significant restrictions on cocaine distribution and sale in the United States that its commercial era was, for practical purposes, over. Vin Mariani ceased production. The papal flask was empty. The testimonials from generals and bishops and queens were filed away in the archives of a company whose founder had died in 1914 without passing his recipe to anyone. Cocaine sits at number 5, not because its story is less significant than what precedes it. The story of how a drug endorsed by the Pope and embedded in the world's most famous soft drink moved from pharmacy shelf to criminal market within a single generation is one of the stranger arcs in commercial history. It sits at number 5 because the entries above it represent something that cocaine, for all its reach, did not quite achieve. Cocaine was sold as what it was: a stimulant, an energizer, a tonic. Its marketing was not, at its core, a deception about category. It was sold as something that made you feel good, and it did make you feel good, and what was concealed was not the effect, but the cost. The entries above it were sold as things they were not, sold as medicine when they were weapons, sold as therapy when they were experiments, sold with institutional authority that transformed the decision to take them from a personal choice into something closer to a civic obligation. We are almost at the top of the shelf, but before we reach it, there is one more entry on this level of the cabinet, quieter than cocaine, less famous, almost entirely forgotten by the general public, which is precisely why it belongs here. There is something almost gentle about ether, considered from the right angle. It is a clear, colorless liquid with a distinctly sweet smell, a smell that people who have encountered it in medical or laboratory contexts tend to describe as somehow both sharp and soft at the same time. It evaporates rapidly at room temperature. It is highly flammable. In sufficient concentration, it renders a person unconscious with considerable speed and reliability. Ether, specifically diethyl ether, was first synthesized in the 16th century and was understood in a general way to produce intoxication when inhaled in small quantities and unconsciousness when inhaled in larger ones. For most of its early history, this was considered a chemical curiosity rather than a medical application. The tools to use it practically did not yet exist. That changed in 1846 when a Boston dentist named William Morton administered ether to a patient at Massachusetts General Hospital for the removal of a neck tumor, and the surgery was completed without the patient experiencing any pain at all. And the surgeon conducting the procedure, John Collins Warren, turned to the assembled observers afterward and said, in a sentence that has been quoted ever since, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." Ether anesthesia was one of the genuinely transformative moments in the history of medicine. Before anesthesia, surgery was a brutally limited discipline. Constrained by the amount of pain and shock a human body could survive, performed at a speed that left almost no room for precision, carried out on patients who were fully conscious and fully aware of everything happening to them. Ether changed this. It made surgery survivable in a new way. It opened the body to the kind of careful, extended, precise intervention that would eventually develop into modern surgical medicine. It also, within a remarkably short time, became a social drug. The transition happened in phases. First came what were called ether frolics, gatherings primarily among students and young professionals in Britain and America, at which ether was inhaled recreationally. The effect at low doses was a rapid, brief intoxication, giddiness, laughter, a dissolution of social inhibition, followed by an equally rapid return to sobriety. The short duration was, paradoxically, part of the appeal. An ether frolic could be conducted, recovered from, and concealed within an evening. A man who had spent an hour inhaling ether with friends could be perfectly presentable at the dinner table by 9 o'clock. These gatherings were not illegal. Ether was a legitimate commercial product, sold freely, used widely in medicine, available from any pharmacy or chemical supplier without restriction. The recreational use of a substance whose medical legitimacy was unquestioned attracted, initially, very little official concern. It was, in the vocabulary of the era, a curiosity, something young men did, in the same category as the Laudanum experiments of romantic poets and the opium dreams of literary men who felt that altered consciousness was adjacent to artistic insight. But it was in rural Ireland, beginning in the 1840s and extending through the 1880s and beyond, that ether achieved something it never quite reached elsewhere, a genuine mass social function. The context was specific and important. Ireland in the mid-19th century was in crisis. The Great Famine of the 1840s had killed approximately 1 million people and forced another million to emigrate within the space of 5 years. The communities that remained were impoverished, traumatized, and subject to additional pressures. Among them, the active temperance movement led by Father Theobald Matthew, who traveled the country in the 1840s, persuading hundreds of thousands of people to take pledges of total abstinence from alcohol. The pledges were sincere. The desire for some form of relief from conditions that were, by any measure, extremely difficult to endure was also sincere. And into this particular gap, a population that wanted intoxication and had committed to avoiding alcohol, ether arrived. It was not alcohol. The pledges said nothing about ether. It was sold legally by local merchants and dispensed without any medical gatekeeping whatsoever. It was cheap. A small quantity went a long way. In the villages and townlands of County Derry and Tyrone in particular, ether inhalation became embedded in social life, with a thoroughness that startled visiting observers and journalists who wrote about it with the slightly dazed tone of people reporting something they were not sure would be believed. People drank it, diluted in water or simply swallowed in small direct doses. As well as inhaling it, they used it at social gatherings. They used it on market days. They used it at wakes and at weddings. Medical reports from the region described communities in which ether use was as normalized as beer consumption would have been elsewhere. A doctor visiting Draperstown in County Derry in the 1870s reported that the smell of ether was pervasive in the streets on market days, that vendors sold it openly from stalls, and that men, women, and in some accounts, children, were consuming it publicly without any sense that this required concealment or justification. The tolerance was remarkable. Regular users developed a capacity to consume quantities of ether that would render an inexperienced person profoundly unconscious, and to walk away from the experience apparently functional. They also developed dependency. not the slow accumulation of laudanum or the rapid grip of morphine, but a consistent pattern in which regular users found the interval between doses contracting and the discomfort of abstinence increasing. The practice never quite translated to the level of public health crisis that the opium derivatives produced, partly because ether's effects were so brief and its recovery so rapid that the acute dangers were lower, and partly because the communities involved were already so marginalized that their pharmaceutical habits attracted less sustained official attention than the dependencies of the urban middle classes. Ether's medical use declined through the 20th century as safer and more controllable anesthetics arrived, chloroform first, then the halogenated agents that dominate modern anesthetic practice. Its recreational use faded as other substances became more accessible. It sits at number 4 in this cabinet as a representative of something the more famous entries sometimes obscure: that the pharmaceutical history of the 19th century was not merely a story of corporate products and professional endorsements. It was also a story of ordinary people in ordinary circumstances, doing what people in difficult circumstances have always done, finding whatever was available, whatever was affordable, whatever was legal, and using it to make the difficulty slightly more bearable. The difference between Vin Mariani on a Pope's desk and ether on a market stall in Tyrone is, at a certain level, simply a difference of presentation. The underlying impulse, the desire to feel for a few hours somewhat better than the conditions of one's life would otherwise allow, is the same. Now we go higher on the shelf, and what waits on the shelves above this one was not found in a vineyard or synthesized from a plant or extracted from an ancient agricultural crop. It was dug from the earth, it glowed, and the people who sold it called it perpetual sunshine. In the winter of 1898, Marie Curie and her husband Pierre sat in their makeshift laboratory in Paris. A converted shed with a leaking roof and a dirt floor that the university had provided because no better space was available, and discovered something that would change the understanding of matter itself. They were working with uranium ore, following up on earlier observations that certain substances emitted energy continuously and without any apparent external source. The word for this phenomenon had only recently been coined: radioactivity, a term Marie herself had invented. What she and Pierre found in that shed through months of painstaking chemical separation of enormous quantities of ore were two new elements. One they named polonium, after Marie's homeland of Poland. The other they named radium. Radium glowed. Literally and visibly, the concentrated radium compounds they produced emitted a faint blue-green luminescence in the dark. A light generated not by combustion, not by electricity, but by something happening inside the matter itself. Something that the physics of the 19th century had not fully imagined, and that the physics of the early 20th was only beginning to describe. The public received this discovery with something beyond fascination. Radioactivity was invisible. It passed through solid objects. It released energy from the interior of matter without any fuel and without any burning. To the non-specialist mind of 1900, which had no framework for understanding what atomic decay actually was, radioactivity seemed less like a physical phenomenon and more like a property, a quality, something that radium had and that transferred, at least conceptually, into the products and preparations that contained it. the quality that radioactivity seemed to possess in the public imagination of the early 20th century was vitality. If radium could release energy from within matter, if it could cause inert material to glow and warm and emit invisible rays of force, then surely it could do the same for living tissue. Surely it could stimulate the body, energize the blood, awaken dormant capacities, restore what age and illness and exhaustion had diminished. Surely whatever it did to uranium ore, it could do to human flesh. This was not science. It was not even particularly coherent reasoning when examined carefully. But it arrived at a cultural moment when science itself was performing miracles with such regularity that the distinction between what science could actually demonstrate and what it might plausibly do next had become genuinely difficult for ordinary people to navigate. X-rays had been discovered in 1895. Germ theory had transformed medicine within living memory. The telephone and the electric light had existed for less than 30 years. If these things were possible, what was not? The radium product industry emerged from this confusion and exploited it with considerable commercial efficiency. By the 1910s and 1920s, the market for radioactive consumer products had become substantial. Radium-branded preparations proliferated. Face creams, toothpaste, chocolate, water crocks that claimed to infuse drinking water with radioactive energy overnight, suppositories, heating pads, fertilizers, and contraceptives. Most of these contained no radium at all. Radium was extraordinarily expensive. The refinement process required to produce even a small quantity from ore was laborious and costly. And most manufacturers simply used the word as a marketing category, the way a later era might use the word natural or organic, as a signal of desirable properties, rather than as a factual description of contents. But some products contained actual radium, and of these, the most commercially successful and the most lethal was a preparation called Radithor. Radithor was the creation of a man named William John Allenby Bailey, born in Boston in 1884. Bailey had attended Harvard briefly. The accounts differ on the details and duration of his enrollment, but he had not graduated, and he possessed no medical degree of any kind. He referred to himself in his commercial materials as Dr. Bailey. The title was not earned. It was constructed in the same way that his entire professional identity was constructed. From the available materials of public trust and institutional language, assembled into a shape that resembled authority without containing it. Bailey had been convicted of mail fraud in an earlier enterprise before pivoting to the radium business. By 1918, he had founded the Bailey Radium Laboratories of East Orange, New Jersey, and developed his flagship product, Radithor, described in his marketing materials as certified radioactive water. It was distilled water containing at least 1 microcurie each of radium-226 and radium-228. Unlike most of his competitors, Bailey put actual radium in his product. The radioactivity was real. The certifications on the label were genuine measurements of actual radioactive content. The claims on the label were not genuine. Radithor was marketed across its commercial life as a cure for approximately 160 separate conditions. The advertising described it as perpetual sunshine, an internalized source of energy and vitality that would restore the body to its optimal functioning. It was pitched especially for fatigue and for impotence, the latter backed by a single scientific paper, cited in Bailey's promotional materials with some enthusiasm. which had found that radium water could increase the sexual passion of water newts. The water newt evidence was, in the pre-Viagra world of the 1920s, apparently sufficient for a great many men. Physicians were offered a 17% commission on every bottle they recommended to patients. The bottles were small, half a fluid ounce, and cost approximately $1 each, equivalent to roughly $15 to $19 in contemporary terms. Between 1925 and 1930, Bailey sold 400,000 bottles. The most famous of Radithor's customers was a man named Eben McBurney Byers. Byers was, by any measure, a man of considerable standing. He had been born in 1880 in Pittsburgh to a wealthy family with extensive interests in iron and steel. He had attended Yale. He had won the United States Amateur Golf Championship in 1906. He was physically imposing, socially prominent, and well connected to the industrial and social elite of the eastern United States. He was, in the vocabulary of his era, a man in the prime of life, the sort of man who appeared in society pages and on clubhouse steps, and at the kinds of dinners where decisions about large amounts of money were made. In the autumn of 1927, Byers was returning by train from the Harvard-Yale football game when he fell from his berth and injured his arm. The injury was not severe, but it was persistently painful, and a physician attending him, in one of those referrals that becomes impossible to trace cleanly through the historical record, but that changed everything, recommended Radithor as a restorative. Byers began drinking it. He found it effective, or rather, and this distinction matters, he found that he felt better after taking it, which is not quite the same thing. Radithor contained no analgesic. It had no pharmacological mechanism that would specifically address the pain of an arm injury. What it contained was radium, and what radium does to the human body is not the same as what it does to water newts or to uranium ore. But Byers experienced what he experienced, and what he experienced was sufficient to make him a devoted and consistent consumer. He began drinking multiple bottles per day. Over the following years, he consumed an estimated 1,400 bottles of Radithor, possibly more. Some accounts cite a figure closer to 1,500. He arranged for regular shipments. He recommended it to friends. He wrote to Bailey personally, describing the benefits he had experienced. He was, in the language of commercial endorsement, a satisfied customer. Radium, when ingested, does not behave like most toxic substances. It does not produce acute, obvious symptoms in the short term. It does not announce itself. Instead, because radium is chemically similar to calcium, the body routes it through the same metabolic pathways as calcium. It is deposited in bone. It accumulates there, slowly and steadily, over months and years. And as it accumulates, it irradiates the surrounding tissue from the inside. Silently, invisibly, continuously, the bone begins to die. By 1930, Byers had begun to lose weight. His jaw was aching. He was suffering from headaches that did not respond to the usual remedies. A physician who examined him in 1931 found what no physician wanted to find: bone tissue that was deteriorating in ways that did not correspond to any known disease process. The holes were in his skull. The structure of his jaw was compromised. The bone was, in the clinical language of the reports, literally dissolving. His jaw had to be removed. Most of his skull had to be removed. The holes in his head were patched with plaster. He lost more than 40 pounds. The man who had won the golf championship was unrecognizable. He died on April 1st, 1932, radium poisoning. He was 51 years old. He was buried in a lead-lined coffin. The lead intended to contain the radiation that his body was still emitting and would continue to emit. When researchers exhumed his remains in 1965 for scientific study, his skeleton registered 225,000 becquerels of radiation. 33 years after his death, his bones were still actively radioactive. Because rhodium has a half-life of 1,600 years, and the radium in his skeleton would not have decayed appreciably in the decades since his burial. The Wall Street Journal covered the story of Byers' death under a headline that has passed into a particular category of historical summary, the kind that is darkly funny until you remember what it is actually describing. The headline read, "The radium water worked fine until his jaw fell off." The FDA had issued warnings about Radithor during its commercial period. They had the authority to warn. They did not at the time have the authority to ban. The regulatory framework that would have allowed them to pull a product from sale based on demonstrated harm did not yet exist in sufficient strength to act. Byers' case, reported widely, described in detail in the press, impossible for the public to ignore, became a significant element in the political pressure that would eventually produce stronger regulatory legislation. The radium fad collapsed after 1932. Radithor went out of production. Bailey, who had sold 400,000 bottles of radioactive water to trusting customers, died in 1949 of bladder cancer. The irony is considerable. The man who sold radioactive water to others was himself destroyed by the radiation he had handled in producing it. The radium girls, the factory workers who had painted luminescent watch dials with radium paint and been told by their supervisors to sharpen their brushes by pressing them between their lips, were pursuing their legal cases through this same period, establishing through the courts the principle that an employer had a legal obligation not to knowingly expose workers to substances whose dangers were understood. They are a parallel story, running alongside Radithor in the same years, driven by the same institutional logic, that the danger of radium was known at levels above the people experiencing it, and that those people were not warned. What the story of Radithor demonstrates, in its particular and specific way, is that institutional authority, the title of doctor, the language of science, the apparatus of certification, can be assembled into a structure that functions, commercially and socially, identically to the real thing. That a convicted fraudster with no medical degree could market radioactive water to a Yale-educated golf champion with physician referral and laboratory certification and sell 400,000 bottles in 5 years tells us something about the relationship between trust and verification in a world that has not yet developed the infrastructure to distinguish between them. The next entry is larger than Radithor, larger than Vin Mariani, larger than heroin. Not because it was more addictive, not because it killed more individuals, but because what it represents is the full weight of a state, an entire government, an entire military apparatus, an entire industrial production system, deployed in the service of pharmaceutical distribution, on a scale that no individual fraudster or corporate marketing department could have approached. This was not a man with a laboratory and a title. This was a country. Number 2. Pervitin. In the winter of 1937, a German chemist named Friedrich Hauschild was working at a pharmaceutical company called Temmler Werke in Berlin when he successfully synthesized a compound that Japanese chemists had originally produced at the end of the previous century, but that had never been manufactured commercially in the West. The compound was methamphetamine, Hauschild had been paying attention. The 1936 Berlin Olympics had introduced him to the American amphetamine benzedrine, which had been used, with some notoriety, as a performance-enhancing substance by athletes. He understood that a close chemical cousin, methamphetamine, slightly more potent, slightly more lipid-soluble, crossing the blood-brain barrier with somewhat greater efficiency than amphetamine, might represent a significant commercial opportunity. Daimler-Werke patented the synthesis process. By the winter of 1937 to 1938, they had given the product a brand name. They called it Pervitin. The initial marketing positioned Pervitin as a consumer product, an energy supplement for the modern person. It was advertised with a kind of cheerful directness that the era permitted, as a remedy for fatigue, for depression, for the general difficulty of sustaining alertness through a long working day. The billboards went up in Berlin. The pharmacies stocked it. The product sold. Night shift workers bought it. Students bought it to study through the night. Young people bought it for the same reasons young people in every era have bought stimulants. Because the stimulant worked, and the cost of the working was not immediately apparent. A military doctor named Otto Friedrich Ranke noticed the product and was interested in its potential applications. In 1939, Ranke tested Pervitin on 90 university students. He measured their performance on cognitive tasks, their endurance under sustained effort, their resistance to sleep deprivation. The results were, from a narrow military perspective, compelling. He concluded, in a report that would carry significant consequences, that Pervitin could help Nazi Germany win the war. The timing was not incidental. Germany was preparing to move. The military doctrine that would define the early phase of the Second World War was already being developed. A doctrine of rapid, concentrated, continuous offensive operations that would overwhelm defensive positions before they could be reinforced. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The concept depended on troops who could move faster than the enemy expected, who could sustain offensive action through the night, who could endure the physical and psychological demands of continuous combat without the rest intervals that conventional military thinking assumed were necessary. Sleep is the great limitation of military operations. It is the one biological requirement that cannot be indefinitely deferred by willpower alone. A soldier who has not slept for 48 hours begins to make errors that cost lives, his own and those of everyone around him. A soldier who has not slept for 72 hours is, in most circumstances, functionally useless. The entire operational tempo of the Blitzkrieg required soldiers to operate at a pace that normal biology did not permit. Pervitin permitted it. Between April and July of 1940, as German forces executed the invasion of France and the Low Countries, the Daimler-Werke factory was running at maximum capacity. At peak production, it was pressing 833,000 tablets per day. During those 4 months alone, German servicemen received more than 35 million methamphetamine tablets. The distribution was not covert or irregular. It was organized through the military medical system, issued alongside rations, managed by the same administrative apparatus that managed food and ammunition and equipment. The tablets were given nicknames by the troops: Stuka-Tabletten, Stuka tablets, named for the dive bomber, Hermann Göring-Pillen. Hermann Göring pills, a sardonic reference to the Luftwaffe commander's widely known drug dependencies. In some units, methamphetamine was delivered not as tablets, but as confectionery, Fliegerschokolade, Flyers chocolate, issued to Luftwaffe pilots, Panzerschokolade, Tanker's chocolate issued to tank crews. Chocolate bars containing methamphetamine distributed to fighting men by their government as a standard operational supplement. Medical historian Peter Steinkamp described the relationship between Pervitin and the Blitzkrieg in terms that have been quoted frequently since, because they are precise in a way that is difficult to improve upon. Blitzkrieg was guided by methamphetamine, if not to say that Blitzkrieg was founded on methamphetamine. The Wehrmacht moved through France at a pace that Allied commanders could not initially account for. The speed of the advance, the continuity of pressure, the apparent inability of German troops to exhaust themselves on the schedule that defensive planning had assumed. These were strategic advantages, and some portion of them were pharmaceutical in origin. A soldier named Heinrich Böll was among those serving in the Wehrmacht during this period. He would later become one of the most significant German novelists of the 20th century, a Nobel laureate, a man whose work grappled throughout its length with the moral catastrophe of the Nazi era. In May 1940, from the battlefield in France, he wrote a letter home to his family in Cologne. The letter asked for several things: food, news, and, specifically, more Pervitin. He wrote that it made miracles. He was not being rhetorical. He needed it to function in the conditions he was in, and he had run out. The military authorities were aware, even during the period of heaviest distribution, that Pervitin produced dependency and serious side effects. The German army's own medical inspectorate issued warnings about the risks. The Reich health leader, Leo Conti, was sufficiently alarmed by the pattern of use that he moved to restrict Pervitin. It became prescription only in Germany by late 1941. The regulations were widely ignored. The supply continued through military channels, regardless of what civilian pharmaceutical rules said. Soldiers wrote to their families asking for more because the military supply had become irregular, and the families went to pharmacies and sent it in parcels. The side effects were significant and acknowledged: heart failure, psychotic episodes, suicidal ideation after extended use, the crash that followed sustained stimulant use, the collapse of mood and function that arrives when the drug wears off, was severe enough in soldiers who had been taking it for extended periods to produce combat ineffectiveness of its own. The Wehrmacht was, at various points, managing the dependency that its own pharmaceutical program had created. And here is the detail that sits at the center of what makes Pervitin so specifically significant in this ranking. The detail that places it at number 2 rather than somewhere lower. Nazi ideology was not ambiguous about drugs. The official position of the regime was one of rigorous contempt for substance abuse, which was categorized alongside other forms of moral and racial degeneracy that the state existed to eliminate. The propaganda portrayed the German body as a disciplined, pure, controlled instrument of national will, in explicit contrast to the supposed decadence and weakness of other peoples. The regime celebrated sobriety, physical fitness, self-mastery, while distributing 35 million tablets of methamphetamine to its soldiers in a single 4-month period. The contradiction was not incidental. It was not an oversight or a lapse or a policy that had not been thought through carefully enough. It was a choice made deliberately by a state that had decided that its military objectives required the pharmaceutical modification of human biology, and that the ideological inconvenience of this fact was manageable if the product was distributed through institutional channels and given a clinical name and packaged in the same government issue supplies as everything else. This is what distinguishes Pervitin from every other entry in this cabinet below it. Every other substance we have examined tonight was sold commercially by private actors in a market that lacked the regulatory infrastructure to prevent it. The harms were produced by ignorance, by greed, by the gap between what was known and what was required to be disclosed. They were the harms of an era that had not yet built the systems needed to protect people from the products being sold to them. Pervitin was different. Pervitin was state-sponsored. Pervitin was deliberately administered to millions of people by the government responsible for their welfare, in full knowledge of its addictive properties and its serious side effects, in deliberate contradiction of the same government's official position on drug use, for the purpose of extracting from those people a level of military performance that their unmodified biology could not sustain. It was not a failure of regulation. It was a deployment of power. When the war ended, the world drew a breath. The era of state-sponsored pharmaceutical experimentation on soldiers felt like something that belonged to the conflict. Something that would end when the conflict ended, that was specific to the extremity of those years, that could be filed away in the category of things that total war produces and that peace makes unnecessary. The world was wrong, because the most devastating entry in this cabinet was not produced by wartime extremity. It was produced in peacetime by a legitimate pharmaceutical company, reviewed by legitimate regulatory agencies, prescribed by legitimate physicians, to the most ordinary and most trusting population imaginable, pregnant women. And what it did to their children is the reason that drug regulation, everywhere in the world, is not the same today as it was before it happened. The number one position in this cabinet does not belong to the most addictive drug on the shelf. It does not belong to the drug that produced the most individual dependency. It belongs to the drug whose story changed the rules entirely, to the drug that proved, beyond any remaining doubt, that the medical establishment could not regulate itself, that oversight was not a bureaucratic inconvenience, but a structural necessity, and that, without it, the people most likely to be harmed were the people least capable of defending themselves. The last straw is the heaviest, and it opens now. In the autumn of 1957, a West German pharmaceutical company called Chemie Grünenthal introduced a new drug to the European market. The drug was called Thalidomide. It had been developed as a sedative and anti-nausea agent. It was mild, in the sense that large doses did not produce the respiratory depression that made barbiturates genuinely dangerous in overdose, a quality that made it seem, relative to what was already available, remarkably safe. The company's literature described it in terms of considerable confidence. It was presented as non-toxic, as suitable for wide use, as a drug that could be given without the anxious dose monitoring that other sedatives required, because the margin between a therapeutic amount and a harmful amount was, so the literature claimed, very wide indeed. Physicians in West Germany received it. Then physicians in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in Australia, in Japan, in 46 countries across the world received it. It was prescribed for insomnia. It was prescribed for anxiety. It was prescribed with particular frequency and particular consequence for morning sickness in early pregnancy. No serious clinical trials had been conducted in pregnant women before it was distributed. This was not unusual. In 1957, the regulatory frameworks governing drug approval in most of the world did not require demonstration of safety in pregnant populations before a drug was licensed. The general assumption, the assumption that underlay the entire pharmaceutical industry's approach to this question, was that unless a drug was specifically known to cross the placental barrier and affect fetal development, it could be considered safe for pregnant women on the basis of its general safety profile. This assumption had never been rigorously tested. It had simply been held. Thalidomide crossed the placental barrier. The first reports of unusual birth defects began arriving at Chemie Grunenthal as early as 1959. Children born with phocomelia, a condition in which the long bones of the limbs fail to develop, leaving hands and feet growing directly from the shoulders and hips, projecting from the torso without the intervening arm or leg. In ordinary medicine, phocomelia was extraordinarily rare. One case in several million births. Suddenly it was appearing in clusters, in hospitals across West Germany, and then across Europe, and then across every country where thalidomide had been distributed. The timeline of awareness was not clean. The connection between thalidomide and the birth defects was not established in a single moment of revelation. It accumulated. A German pediatrician named Widukind Lenz began collecting cases in 1961, interviewing mothers, tracing the common thread. In November of 1961, he presented his findings to Chemie Grunenthal, directly and to the broader medical community, through a letter published in a German medical journal. He had found the common thread. The mothers of children born with phocomelia had, in nearly every case, taken thalidomide during the first trimester of pregnancy, precisely the window during which the fetal limbs were forming. Chemie Grunenthal withdrew thalidomide from the West German market in November 1961. Other countries followed. By 1962, the withdrawal was largely complete across the countries where it had been distributed. The total number of children affected worldwide is estimated at more than 10,000. In some accounts, the figure is placed higher. The data from certain countries was incomplete. The diagnosis wasn't always correctly made, and the full scope of the disaster took years to document comprehensively. 10,000 is the figure most commonly cited by historians and medical researchers. 10,000 children born with limbs that were not there because their mothers had taken a drug that had been told to them by their physicians, by the pharmaceutical literature, by the regulatory apparatus of their governments, was safe. Now we need to go back 1 year, to September of 1960, to a desk in Washington, D.C. The United States had not yet approved thalidomide. The application had been submitted to the Food and Drug Administration by an American company called Richardson Merrill, which held the licensing rights for the U.S. market and was eager to bring it to American pharmacies before the Christmas season. A commercially significant window for over-the-counter products. The FDA assigned the application to a reviewer named Frances Kathleen Oldham Kelsey. Kelsey was 46 years old. She had earned a doctorate in pharmacology from the University of Chicago and a medical degree from the same institution. She had worked as a laboratory researcher, a medical editor, a university professor, and a practicing physician before joining the FDA in 1960. The thalidomide application was, by her own later account, essentially her first significant assignment at the agency. She read the application and found it inadequate. Not fraudulent at this stage, not obviously dangerous, simply inadequate. The data submitted in support of the safety claims did not, in her scientific judgment, meet the standard of reliable evidence that should precede approval. The clinical trial reports were incomplete. The data on absorption and metabolism was thin. There were reports from Europe of peripheral neuropathy, nerve damage, in patients who had taken thalidomide long-term, and these reports had not been satisfactorily addressed in the application's safety documentation. She requested more information. Richardson Merrill's representatives were not pleased. They had a commercially significant product that was already selling successfully across Europe and in dozens of other markets. They had a Christmas window that was narrowing. They had a new FDA reviewer, a woman relatively junior in institutional terms, on what was essentially her first significant case, asking questions that they felt had already been adequately answered. They pushed back. The company's sales representatives began visiting Kelsey's office. Not occasionally, regularly, persistently. They called her telephone at intervals that, in the documented accounts, crossed the boundary between professional follow-up and something that more closely resembled pressure. They wrote to her supervisors, suggesting that her requests for additional data were unreasonable, obstructionist, the product of excessive caution in a reviewer who did not fully appreciate the drug's established European safety record. Kelsey did not move. She requested more information. The company provided responses. She found the responses inadequate and requested further information. She noted that the peripheral neuropathy reports had not been satisfactorily explained. She noted that the metabolism data remained incomplete. She noted, and this was the observation that would later be recognized as the most consequential single scientific instinct in the history of American drug regulation, that the application had provided no satisfactory data on what thalidomide did when taken during pregnancy. She held, through 1960, through the first months of 1961, through repeated visits and repeated calls and repeated letters to her supervisors suggesting she was being unreasonably difficult, she held. In November 1961, Widukind Lenz published his findings in Germany. The connection between thalidomide and phocomelia was established. The European withdrawals began. Richardson Merrill withdrew their application. Thalidomide was never approved for sale in the United States. This was not a complete protection. The company had distributed what it described as experimental samples to approximately 20,000 American patients, including pregnant women, through physicians who had agreed to participate in what the company called a clinical trial. But that was, in practice, a pre-approval distribution program. 17 confirmed cases of thalidomide-related birth defects were documented in the United States, with dozens more suspected. The word experimental, applied to a distribution of this scale and conducted with this level of monitoring, was doing considerable work. But the thousands of cases that would have followed a full commercial approval, the American arm of what became a global disaster, did not happen. Because of one desk, one reviewer, one refusal to accept that a commercial timeline was a substitute for scientific evidence. On August 7, 1962, President John F. Kennedy stood in the White House and awarded Frances Oldham Kelsey the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service, the highest honor the United States government could give to a civilian employee. She was only the second woman ever to receive it. Kennedy's citation described her contribution precisely. Her exceptional judgment in evaluating a new drug for safety for human use had prevented a major tragedy of birth deformities in the United States. The same year, Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The amendments fundamentally changed what drug approval in America meant. Before the amendments, a drug company was required to demonstrate that its product was safe. After the amendments, a company was required to demonstrate both safety and efficacy, that the drug worked as claimed, and that it worked as claimed for the specific populations to whom it would be prescribed. The amendments required adequate and well-controlled clinical trials as the basis for approval. They required informed consent from participants in those trials. They gave the FDA the authority to withdraw drugs from the market based on post-approval safety findings. Drug historians have a phrase for this moment. They describe pharmaceutical regulation as existing in two eras, before thalidomide and after Kelsey. Everything that came before, the laudanum sold from grocery stalls, the heroin in buyers' amber glass bottles, the radium water with the papal endorsement, the methamphetamine in the government-issued chocolate. All of it existed in the before, in the era when the distance between a product and its harm was managed by the private conscience of the people selling it, by the slowly accumulating evidence of physicians watching their patients deteriorate, by the regulatory agencies that could warn but frequently could not stop. The after is not perfect. It has never been perfect. Drugs have been approved in the after that caused harm. Drugs have been withdrawn from the market in the after. The systems built since 1962 have not made pharmaceutical catastrophe impossible. As the opioid crisis of the late 20th and early 21st centuries demonstrates with painful clarity, the structures are stronger. They are not invincible. They require, perpetually, the willingness of individuals within them to behave as Kelsey behaved, to hold the line against pressure, to require evidence rather than accept assurance, to understand that the person most damaged by an inadequate approval is not the reviewer who approved it, but the patient who trusted it. Thalidomide sits at number 1 in this cabinet, not because it produced the most addiction. Laudanum did more of that, measured across more lives, across more years. Not because it was sold most cynically. Buyers' continued marketing of heroin after the dependency evidence arrived is a strong competitor for that particular dishonor. Not because it represents the largest institutional betrayal. Pervitin, 35 million tablets distributed by a government to its own soldiers, makes a compelling claim to that designation. Thalidomide sits at number 1 because of what its victims could not do. Every other entry in this cabinet harmed people who had, at some point, made a choice. The choice was uninformed or made under conditions of ignorance and institutional deception, or made by people who did not understand what they were choosing. The choices were not free in any meaningful sense, but they were choices that a person made with a body that was their own, in conditions that were at least theoretically reversible. The children affected by thalidomide made no choice. They were not patients. They were not consumers. They were not people who had taken something in good faith and found that the faith was misplaced. They were in the process of becoming, of forming, in the first weeks of existence, the structures that would carry them through their lives. And those structures were interrupted, were altered before they could be completed, by a drug that a trusted physician had given to their mother, who had taken it because she was sick, and because she trusted the physician who had prescribed it because the literature said it was safe, and the literature said it was safe because the company said it was safe, and the company said it was safe because no one had required them to prove it rigorously enough to discover that it was not. 10,000 children, 46 countries, 1 woman, 1 desk, 1 refusal. That is the number 1 entry in this cabinet. Not a drug that seduced, or a drug that promised escape, or a drug that was sold with glamour and celebrity and the Pope's personal endorsement. A drug that was prescribed as medicine to pregnant women, and that no one had checked carefully enough, and that a single person in Washington, D.C., with enough scientific rigor and enough professional courage to hold against the pressure being applied to her, managed to keep out of one country. Just one. We have walked through all 10 drawers tonight. Chloral Hydrate, the first synthetic sedative that became the first date rape drug. The Bromides that entered the language as a word for emptiness. Laudanum on the kitchen shelf, available for the price of a pint of beer, given to infants by mothers who believed the label. Morphine, isolated by a pharmacy apprentice who named it after the god of dreams, distributed by the millions to soldiers who came home carrying something they had not carried when they left. Heroin, synthesized 11 days after aspirin by the same hands, sold in amber glass with the buyer name stamped across it and the word Non-Addictive printed in good conscience below. Cocaine in a Pope's flask and a pharmacist's soft drink. Ether in the drawing rooms of the respectable and on market day in Tyrone. Radioactive water in a Pittsburgh millionaire's daily routine, dissolving his skeleton from inside, while a convicted fraudster called himself doctor and pocketed $1 per bottle. Methamphetamine in chocolate bars distributed to soldiers by a government that officially despised drug use. And thalidomide on a desk in an application that a woman named Frances Kelsey refused to approve until the evidence was sufficient. And the evidence arrived too late for 10,000 children, and just in time for the regulatory framework that governs pharmaceutical approval to this day. What connects these 10 entries is not, at its core, malice. Some of what happened here involved deliberate deception, Bayer's continued marketing of heroin, Bailey's fraudulent credentials, Kemi Grunenthal's inadequate trials. But a great deal of it did not. A great deal of it was something less dramatic, and in some ways more troubling than malice. It was the ordinary human tendency to trust the systems we have built, to believe that if something is on a pharmacy shelf, it has been checked, that if a physician recommends it, the physician knows what it does, that if a government distributes it, someone has established that the distribution is safe, that if a company with a respected name produces it, the name means something about the product. These are not unreasonable assumptions. They are the assumptions that functional societies require in order to function. We cannot individually verify the safety of everything we consume, any more than we can individually inspect the structural engineering of every bridge we cross. We need systems that do this on our behalf. We need those systems to be honest and competent and sufficiently empowered to act on what they find. The history in this cabinet is largely the history of those systems not yet existing, of the gap between the rate at which chemistry produces new compounds and the rate at which governance develops the tools to evaluate them, of what happens in that gap to the people inside it. The gap has narrowed considerably since 1962. It has not closed. It has never been possible and may never be possible to close it entirely. What can be done? What has been done imperfectly, incrementally, in response to each disaster that proved the necessity of doing it, is to build structures that make the most catastrophic failures less likely. That is not a triumphant conclusion. It is perhaps the only honest one. The cabinet that we have walked through tonight is a historical object. Its specific contents, Radithor and Godfrey's cordial, and Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, and Bayer's amber heroin bottles, are not on any shelf available to you. The regulatory frameworks built in the aftermath of these disasters made most of them impossible. But the cabinet itself, the structure of it, the principle of it, the fact that chemistry moves faster than governance, and that the distance between medicine and poison is frequently a matter of evidence that takes time to accumulate. The cabinet itself is still there. It is always there. It is managed better now than it was in 1899, when a pharmacist in a pressed waistcoat handed a parent a bottle of heroin cough syrup for their child without pausing for a moment to consider that this might require a second thought. Managed better. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. We did not invent evil in a laboratory. We invented ambition and curiosity and the desire to relieve suffering, which is one of the most decent impulses the human species possesses, and which has produced, across the centuries, both the greatest advances in medicine and the greatest pharmaceutical disasters, often through the same mechanism. The impulse to act before the evidence is complete, because the suffering is present and the evidence takes time. The lesson of this cabinet is not that the past was stupid. The people in it were not stupid. They were working with the tools they had, in the systems they had built, toward goals that were frequently genuinely humane. The lesson is that the tools and the systems were not yet adequate to the task, and that they were made more adequate, most often, only by the catastrophes that proved they were not. Rest well tonight. The cabinet is closed.